Hi guys, Andrew Hutchinson here, and in today's video I'm going to be doing another book review for my channel, The Book Hutch, and today I'm going to be talking about 5 sci-fi or fantasy books that I have read over the last few months. I do want to begin by prefacing that in these videos I am a librarian, but I am never espousing views of these books based on any of one else at my library or my library as a whole. These are just my thoughts on these novels, and so I just wanted to make that clear. And I appreciate every single novel that I come across, that I spend time reading or try to read. And also, I want to be an author someday, and so the fact that everyone I review has actually written a book is something to definitely commend. And so no matter what my review is, I definitely want to always give credit to the authors for putting their dreams and work out there. Also, I would never put a book on this channel that I would never recommend. So just even if I give it a low review score, definitely try it. Just because it wasn't for me, it doesn't mean that it's not right for you. I, again, am just expressing my personal views and what I found about these books when reading them. So I just want to begin by prefacing that. Okay, so let's just dive right in. So the first book that I want to review is A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. I read this a couple months ago. I really enjoyed it. It is about a young woman named Diana who is a witch, and though she's not really practicing, her parents were killed when she was a child, and at least from my recollection, she's resistant to magic, and there's some magic she doesn't even know she has. But what ends up happening is she is in college. She is a professor and a researcher, and she one night checks out a manuscript called, I believe, Ashmole 782. And as she spends time with it, she realizes that there is definitely magic coming out of this book. And it sort of sends out this beacon, like she's unlocked something and she doesn't know quite what's happened. And all of a sudden she meets Matthew, a vampire, and Matthew's there to sort of investigate, and all sorts of supernatural things start occurring. Basically, the way I equate it, though it's not nearly the same plot in any capacity, but just sort of when I mention it, is it's a bit kind of like Twilight, just set in a college setting. And what I mean by that is male vampire, female non-vampire. Granted, Bella in the Twilight books was human and Diana's a witch, but there's still that conflict between the two of them. And you know, she eventually meets his family, and so there's similar pieces of the arc. I'm also a sucker for the first Twilight book, and so I know people love to drag that series, but I know the rest of the series gets kind of iffy, and someday I'm probably going to do a review on the Twilight series, but I still really like the first book, Twilight. And that's what this kind of reminded me of, except that it takes place in a college setting, which I found super interesting. It's all about professors and research, and I just thought that was a new take on the vampire love genre. It is a bit violent, so it's interesting. I had another book that I just discussed a few videos ago in my mystery thriller review where I critiqued an author for taking his main character and putting her through too much violence and torture. In this, Diana does get a fair amount of that, but I actually didn't mind it. I felt like it served for the story. It happened for a reason and made me feel for her in different ways. And so I don't mind that. The one critique I had for this book, which is why it's a 3.5 star, even though I found it really enjoyable, is it just kind of meandered a little too much. I don't know if the author had a plan or if she just wrote it chapter by chapter as she went and just kind of decided, let's take them over here now, and let's move them here, and let's have this happen. That's just kind of the vibe I got. The pacing was a little odd. I couldn't tell if we were going somewhere. Like in other books, you know you're going towards something. This I couldn't really super tell. This is part of a trilogy, the All Souls trilogy. I don't honestly know if I'm going to read the next two. Maybe someday, but right now, even though I had a great experience with this first one, I don't know if I'll finish. I also know they have adapted this into a television series, and so I think I will definitely check that out at some point. And if they do the whole series, I might just watch on that. But yeah, so I gave this 3.5 out of 5. I really thoroughly enjoyed it, and if you're a fan of vampires and witches, I would definitely recommend giving it a shot. All right, the next book I'm going to talk about is called Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James. I don't know where to start talking about this book. Let me just start with my rating. I gave it 1.5 stars. I'm conflicted about giving that because I actually didn't finish this novel. And so I don't even know if I should have rated it, but I wanted to rate what I had read so far. And I'm so torn about this book because I had seen it on so many critically acclaimed lists, bestseller lists. I love the cover. It's one of my favorite covers I've seen on a book. I don't know why, I just love it. I read the synopsis. It's about a tracker who's trying to find this kidnapped boy, and there's all of this African mythology that's supposed to be in it. When I was in college, I took an African literature class, and I've read a number of books written by prominent African authors with some African mythology. I'm very interested in that. So I felt like this was going to be right up my alley and that I was going to have a fabulous time reading it. I started reading, and the way that the author writes, my brain doesn't connect to it. I don't know how else to describe it. It's almost impossible for me to figure out what's going on. And then immediately a few scenes in, it gets very graphic. And from what I've read in some other reviews, it stays pretty graphic through a lot of violence, even some sexual violence through the whole thing. And again, I never mean to say that I'm a prude with these things. I've read the Game of Thrones series, which I greatly enjoyed. I'm not that, reading about that, any of that isn't a turnoff. It's just, I didn't see the point. I didn't understand how any of it was connecting. I couldn't follow anything cohesively. I had no idea what was going on. I think I maybe made it 70 pages, and then I just had to stop and put it away. I don't believe I'll be trying again. And that's not to say that I don't feel this book has something in it. I just feel like it's going to take a very specific type of reader to get through it. And maybe if they adapt it into a series, I might watch it and enjoy it. That's the best way I can describe it. So don't take my low rating of 1.5. I think it's the lowest I've given a book, maybe ever. Don't take that as a reason not to try it. Just a disclaimer that there's a lot of violence in it. It's very graphic in detail. And I had a hard time following the plot and how it was written, but maybe you won't. And so and it could have just been too that I was so disappointed that I really wanted to get into this book and I couldn't, but I'll just let that be what it is. So I gave it a 1.5. That's just is where I have to leave it with that book. Okay, the next book is The Fifth Season by NK Jemisin. Now this book is interesting because it, in a similar vein to Black Leopard, Red Wolf, I had a hard time reading this. NK Jemisin, as an author, at least in my perception, she's not here to hold your hand when telling a story. She creates a world. She creates a very rich, dynamic, thorough world. And then she takes her readers and she drops them smack in the middle of it without any explanation about what's happening. And you have to figure it out as you go. And I appreciate that to a degree. This was intense. Without me also trying to go and look up summaries of what I had just read, I would probably have not gotten what the entire story was about. But I do want to say that I found reading this a very enriching experience. And I enjoyed the main character of Essen. I thought she was very dynamic, and I wanted to find out what happened to her. I also think it's interesting that there's a portion of this novel that is written in second person. And so you're reading it as you go here, you do this, you see this. And I had never read that in a book before, and I really liked it. I know a lot of people were put off by it. I greatly enjoyed it. And overall, I felt like she just created a really amazing world. And so even though I had a very difficult time connecting with the literature, and it took me a long time to get through the book, I could tell the quality of the story. And that's why I gave it 4 stars. I don't think I'll be reading the next 2 in the series. It's called the Broken Earth Trilogy, because it took so much out of me to read this first one, but I could tell how much she put in it. I could tell how rich it was. Her use of language is incredible, and I really enjoy her as an author. So that's why I still gave it 4, even though personally it was very hard for me to read. Also, all 3 of her books in this trilogy won a Hugo Award for Best Novel, which is the biggest award in the sci-fi fantasy genre. She's the first African-American author to do it. She's very outspoken about more African-American writers or writers of color being included in sci-fi and fantasy, which I think is very important. And I went and watched on YouTube her acceptance speech of her 3rd Hugo Award that she won for the last novel. I think it's called The Stone Sky. And I definitely recommend watching that speech. And she calls people out, and I am here for it. So NK Jemisin, I very much appreciate your place in sci-fi and fantasy. And I think I'm going to go back and try some of her other books as well and whatever she writes in the future. So I'm not going to let this one hinder me, but I still found it at least a semi-enjoyable read, but I could tell that it was amazing, even if I didn't click as much with it as I thought it would. All right, the next 2 books are going to be by the same author. So the first one I'm going to talk about is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. I actually read this book after her other one, which is going to be the next book I review in a moment. So I read this second, even though this was her first book. And I had heard a lot of acclaim from it and was very intrigued by it. I really enjoy Greek mythology, though I do not consider myself an expert in it. I know enough to get by names who the gods and goddesses were. But what's really great about this book is it's about Achilles to a degree, the demigod who's involved in the Trojan War. But it's also about a prince named Patroclus. And when you read the Iliad, it talks about them having this intense connection, which many historians have interpreted to be romantic. But sometimes that gets washed out and people just sort of say, no, that's not really what it was. It was more brotherly love, or it was just more camaraderie. No, it wasn't that. And Madeline Miller, in her book, she explores that, no, really, they did have a love between them. These 2, well, one human male and a demigod, they fell in love. And they had a very complicated love story because one of them is on a hero's journey and the other is just watching it unfold and trying to love the hero, even though he's unsure of his own place in the hero's story. And reading this from Patroclus's perspective was just so fascinating, endearing, and heartbreaking, because he is sort of just an average human. And for whatever reason, Achilles falls in love with him, and he doesn't understand why, and no one else understands why. But Achilles just says, I love you. I don't need to explain. I just love you. And they have this beautiful romance. I enjoyed reading about it. When they end up going to the war, it really follows the Iliad. What's nice is that you don't need to have read the Iliad to follow this book. Madeline does a great job explaining who everybody is that's involved, as well as the action sequences. I'm personally a little less interested in reading about war, and so I started to taper off a little bit in the war scenes as being as engaged. But at the ending, I came back. It really made me cry. Normally, when I cry as much as I did with this book, it would get a 5-star because it invoked a big emotional reaction for me. I'm still giving it 4 stars just because I felt the last third just didn't quite engage me the way that the rest did. But I highly recommend this. It is a wonderful novel. And what I also really enjoy about it is the fact that it's not pushing an LGBTQ agenda. Never does it say that Achilles or Patroclus are gay. It just says that they fall in love with each other and they just have a love story and we read about it. And I enjoyed that, to not put labels on them, but to just explore a love story between 2 people, and especially within the context of all this Greek mythology. I just thought it was a beautiful, beautiful book. So definitely recommend that. And like I said, I gave that one 4 stars. Her next book Madeline Miller's next book is Circe, and this was the first one of hers that I read. I gave this 4.5 stars out of 5. I really enjoyed this book for many reasons. So I didn't know a lot about Circe. I had actually taught a little bit of the Odyssey, which is this book is more based around when I was a middle school history teacher. And I kind of missed out on paying attention to Circe because Odysseus lands on her island and he goes to her sort of home on the island, and she's already, they could tell she's this witch. She's a very powerful witch, and they sort of demand of her that she takes care of them. And she immediately sort of crumbles and says, absolutely, I will take care of you. But that's already after she's turned a few of his men into pigs, and there's no really explanation as to why. Then she and Odysseus fall in love. She takes care of him. She nurses him back to health. She sends him on his way, and is sort of just a minor character in the story. So when I saw this book, I was very intrigued about how you could build an entire book around that character. And I watched an interview with Madeline Miller where she talked about how that segment of the story where there's this really powerful witch and Odysseus just walks in and says, take care of me. And she just goes, oh, absolutely. Drove her nuts as a child. She's like, I don't think this character would do that. And so she explored more of who Circe was, and we get to see more of so many different sides of her character that I feel make much more sense. Though Madeline Miller has even said she's filling in gaps with her own imagination, I feel like she does a pretty good job of explaining this character. So Circe is a demigod, and so she's half god, half mortal. And it puts her in a precarious position because gods do not feel emotion. They're entirely self-centered and they only care about what's happening to themselves. They do not have empathy about human beings. And Circe has questions as to who are humans, and she wants to get to know them, but she feels conflicted about that. And she's punished in the beginning of the book because she performs an act of kindness, which to the gods is so foreign. You would never do anything altruistic for anybody else. You would only do it for yourself. So she's punished. She's sent to an island on her own, and she essentially becomes, in the Western Hemisphere world, the first witch. She starts teaching herself magic. And what I loved about this book is it is so sensory rich. So when she's talking about the temperature outside, I could feel it on my skin. When she was talking about what Circe could smell, I could smell it. She talks a lot about what Circe uses with her hands and how she's chopping up ingredients for things, and I could almost feel, and it really immersed me into that world. And what I loved about this book most of all is when Odysseus arrives, you get the sense of why Circe reacts the way that she does. And it is definitely safe to say that this is a very feminist novel, but it's not beating you over the head with it. It is just saying that this is a woman who, when a group of men show up and expect her to do a lot for them and then try to, by force, make her do those things for him, she fights back. And it almost makes sense that why in Western literature that may have been erased and sort of pushed down a little bit as, no, she was very obedient, when really, no, she does hold her own. Why she turns these men into pigs, why she really stands her own ground. But also you can see her relationship with Odysseus and why that does develop. And so I found her as Circe such a multi-dimensional character, and I cared about what happened to her until the very last page. And this book stayed with me a while after I finished reading it, and I definitely think I will reread it again in the future. And so that would be my number one recommend on this list. But like I said, and as I always say in these videos, if any of these 5 books stuck out to you, I would highly recommend checking them out. I do enjoy the sci-fi fantasy genre. I'm not super well read into a lot of it, so I definitely want to explore more. If you have any recommendations of other books I should check out, feel free to comment down below. And also, if you have any similar differing opinions about these books, feel free to comment and let me know. I always would love to hear what other people think about them. And yeah, thanks for stopping by and watching this video and checking out my channel. I'm going to definitely keep making more book reviews in the future, as well as more library themed content. And as always, thank you so much for stopping by and have a good one. Bye.